G'day. Today's recording will be with my first on my channel interview with someone. Her name is Mary Ruddick. She's a nutritionist based out of Athens, Greece, and she'll basically give us a bit of an outline on what the real Mediterranean diet is, some elements of the past, some current elements, the differences between rural and urban areas, and some of the actual elements that are still there, and a bit of a background on the different areas that she's actually visited, because there are some regional differences, so we can get a bit of an idea of what Greeks really eat from somebody other than myself. I mean, I've got a bit of a dated perception when it comes to Greece, which goes all the way back to the 70s and all that. Mary's got a more recent and more contemporary sort of view about Greece and what people truly eat and still continue to eat, the sort of traditions, the sort of differences in the age sort of or generations, sort of which will give us an idea of the food environment there and the changes that have happened, but also the stuff that still remains strong within that tradition. And also demystify some of the actual nonsense that we've been hearing for a very long time in regards to the so-called blue zone, Ikaria type diet, and in general what Greeks consume. Now, for Mary's subscribers, I'll just give a bit of an outline about myself. About a decade ago, I ended up with cardiovascular disease in my mid-40s. I'm in my mid-50s now. And at the time, it was a bit of a shock to the system. But once I sort of went through that experience and then coming out of it and surviving it and looking into my own sort of traditions and realizing how far I'd actually moved away from them, I sort of stayed with Dad for a while, gravitated back to a high-fat Mediterranean diet, felt better, got stronger over time, then shifted to a sort of a paleo diet. Then for a period, a couple of years after that, I moved over to a low-carb diet, did keto, and sort of for the last nearly 2 years, I've been pretty much on a carnivore diet, and I feel great for it. Much stronger. All my skin issues have cleared up. I used to get a lot of pimples all over my body, including my sort of stomach area and even on my face. A lot of it's gone. It's cleared up. And I put it down to eliminating seed oils and sugar from my diet, which were heavy. And large reasons for me having the cardiovascular disease, I attribute to those two toxins in the foods that I was consuming for a number of years. I'd come back from Greece. I'd lived in Greece for about 6 odd years. I did my high school there, came back to Australia in the mid 80s, and basically that was the beginning of the low fat craze, and I jumped on it like everyone else, and I really jumped on it because I was a bit of a person who liked to read and all that, and started looking at some of this information and accepted it at face value. And pretty much like a lot of people, and I went a bit more religious on it. I used to criticize my father about him using olive oil and animal fats, and that he should switch to vegetable oils and seed oils and stuff like that. And he pretty much told me what he thought about all that, and it wasn't much. But that's a bit of an outline about where I'm at. Now I'll bring Mary on, and I'll give her a chance to introduce herself to my subscribers and and a bit about her own journey, and and a bit about her nutritional work and stuff like that, and then we'll get into looking at Greece and a bit of the blue zone mythology that has been perpetuated, and why and how and it's come about and stuff like that, some of the details. Anyway, let me just bring Mary on. Hi, Mary.
Hey.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So everything seems to be working fine. Recording seems to be working fine. I'll let you introduce yourself to my subs. We're recording.
Hi, I'm Mary Ruddick. I'm a nutritionist from the States, but I travel the world studying traditional diets. I got into this by accident after going through a significant illness of my own and seeing how upside down the dietary recommendations were. And so I've spent the last several years studying the globe, studying traditional diets, and seeing how different they are than perhaps we're often told they are. I've been videoing this whole journey, and at one point I'm going to get this all up on YouTube, but I've been very busy in my private practice, which I take along with me on the road. I'm currently teaching several classes. I've got several programs and quick start guides and those kind of things. And I've got some really good trips up in the horizon as well. I spent a lot of this year, actually really most of this year, in Africa and then also in Greece, where I am now. Went to Ikaria, the Blue Zone, and we're going to talk about that later today. And in the new year, I'm headed back to Africa with some really great guys, Dr. Paul Saladino, Dr. Anthony Gustin, Brian Sanders. We've got a great little tribe that we're going to go with. And we're going to study as many traditional diets as we can, contrast them to the modern version, and see how the health is different amongst the two.
That sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got an interesting schedule, but got trapped in Greece for a while. But it gave you an opportunity to sort of go around Greece, see some of the regional cuisine and what people do and stuff like that.
It's been wonderful. I've been based in Greece for the last couple of years, but I usually travel full time. So until Corona, I was in a different country almost every week for quite some time. Yeah. So it's been nice to spend more time in Greece, get to know the language a bit better, get to go to some of these zones like the mountainous regions, and go to lots of different islands and all those kinds of things. It's very easy to take day trips here and quick trips, which has been really, really wonderful.
Did you get a chance to go to any of the mountainous regions on the West Coast?
Yeah, I've been to quite a few. Yeah. So one spot that I haven't been to yet is really up north by Thessaloniki. I haven't been up there yet. Yeah, but the rest of, there's so much to explore in Greece. I think you could spend a whole lifetime exploring Greece, but I have done, the major bullet points for sure.
That's true. Yeah, it is quite an extensive amount of islands and different little villages and towns that have got their own localized traditions as well, some variations, which you've probably come across. And even standard foods, there are variations, like feta cheese can be different in different areas, and a whole lot of different other foods in that regard.
Completely.
What is the sort of give us a bit of an outline of, I've given an outline to people in the past of what Greece used to be like in the 70s, because there was no processed food at the time. The only sort of processed food you could call was from a Zaharoplastio, which is a place that actually sells sweets, and they still exist. And it was primarily people would buy them for name days and stuff like that, because you'd go to somebody's place, you didn't have a meal, you had coffee and a sweet, and it was basically that sort of thing. And that tradition still exists in Greece in that regard. But things have changed. I noticed certain changes in 2006, but you're actually living there, and you could probably give us an idea of what people are eating, even in the urban areas.
Things have really changed drastically in the urban areas. Less so, but to some extent in the more remote areas, but very much in the modern areas. So it's still, I'm in the heart of Athens, and you can still get all the traditional foods, and the grandmas are definitely eating those. But the younger generations are eating a lot of potato, a lot of tomato, a lot of sweets. There's an ice cream shop everywhere you go, really on every corner. So far more desserts, although still in comparison to places like the States and Europe, I would still say less sweets than most of those countries. And we can go into that, what the desserts are typically like here and that kind of thing. But the influx, I would say, of the potato has been the biggest change. Even in my partner, he's Greek, and he's lived in Greece in and out for the last, 4 decades or so. And he's seen huge changes in Athens alone. So when he went to high school here, they didn't put potatoes or fries in the sandwiches, right? In the heroes. And now they really do. Yeah. And they started doing that about maybe 20 years ago. They started doing that. So he's even seen that drastic change of kind of the influx of those kind of junky foods come into the diet. You still don't see a lot of breakfast being eaten here. It's usually coffee, right? So something very light and that kind of thing. And there's still a huge meat focus. Greece is very meaty. So you'll often just see a person sitting down to a whole pile of meat and that kind of thing. But there will be bread served on the side or fries served on the side and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that hasn't changed a lot, because the thing that Greece is well known for is its grill culture.
That's amazing.
Yes, as they're called. And they're just all over the place. They litter the place. It's just Greeks love meat. They
love meat. In fact, there are so many restaurants that have meat in the title, from Meat Zone to Pizza.
Exactly.
Meat. Luckily, and I think that's what's really saved the health of the Greek nation, is that they've still maintained that high meat while bringing in these other foods as well. So they're at least getting that nutrition from all the protein and the vitamins, the nutrients within the meat.
That's true. They're still getting the micronutrient side, and that can help because that can mitigate slightly. I mean, if you get more chromium, that helps with mitigating slightly blood glucose levels. So a number of things that have come into the diet in terms of eating some organ meats, particularly the older generation, that are much healthier. And that sort of mitigates some of the indiscretions, because even they are, I did notice some of the older people in 2006, they were a bit, compared to the generation of my grandfather or his father, they were very different. My grandfather, I'd never seen him eat a sweet in his life. He passed away from pneumonia at 87, but up until that point, and that was just because he was stubborn and didn't want to go to the doctor. He thought he could, survive, so to speak. He'd had colds before, and he just didn't listen to my uncle, Dad's twin brother, who pestered him to go to the doctor. And by the time he got, it had progressed too much, which is unfortunate. But the older people are a bit like that, the stoic. They don't run every second just because they have a bit of a sniffle to the doctors. It's just the way they are,
Yes.
But there can be risks associated with that. If you get something like pneumonia or whatever, it can knock you off your perch, so to speak. But his father lived longer, to 107. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's very significant. And what did he pass of? Was it just old age?
Just old age. We don't really know whether it was, what exactly we know he passed out at a much older age, but exactly from whether it was just old age. He didn't have any ailments. My father couldn't remember that he had any ailments. He still was strong until the end, and he was robust. Well, and he hated vegetables. He just basically ate dairy. And that's the other part of the Greek culture. We consume as much milk as the Swiss,
Yes.
and it's pretty much a dairy meat. And that's what my great grandfather consumed. And even my grandfather was very much like that. either he had some, he didn't really, he wasn't big in kukuretsi like a lot of other older people are, but he did like friganella, which is, the really, those, what do they call, the easiest thing that I could explain it is liver chips, because they're really just thin, narrow, and they just cook to buggery. So they actually very crunchy type liver little snacks. And he loved those with his wine and stuff like that. So, or his ouzo. So that was basically, the way he fed him, well, what he consumed and stuff like that. But he was robust. I mean, he would walk around the village, and this is in a mountainous area where you're talking about an older person in their 70s or 80s walking downhill, along a cliffside or whatever. It's just not something that people do normally. Just like,
no, that is such a difference. And that's still the case here. So we're in full lockdown right now, but you're allowed to leave for exercise. And so you can go to the beach and go swimming. And I've been here the last few winters, and it's just the same as it always was. There's people in their 80s and 90s going out for a daily swim, and it's pretty cold here right now.
That's right.
But they just go and they do their little exercises, kind of like their 50s style exercises before getting in the water, and then they go for a swim, and they are out there for a long time. It is not a quick Wim Hof dip. They are there for a very long time, and then they come out, and a lot of times they'll make themselves like a mountain tea or a chamomile tea before they go in. So they'll have that hot tea.
That's
and
right.
They'll shower off, and they'll just kind of chill with their family for a while. And then after an hour or so, they'll go home. But it's a daily affair for most of the people, I would say, in Athens, especially the elderly. They're very robust.
That's
and
right.
They hike in mountains, they go and collect the greens, and they're not using wheelchairs, they're taking the stairs. Some of the yayas here, they go up, 6 floors of stairs, which are made out of marble and slick and spiral. I mean, they're a death staircase, but they just go up and down them all the time as if it's totally normal, hauling up all their groceries, taking down their trash. Yeah. The robustness is incredible.
Yeah, and it sort of testifies to the strong animal-based diet, which is the predominant part of the diet in Greece. And even when they are actually eating, they're eating things like, you probably have heard what we call agaria horta, which is the sort of wild,
horta. I love the horta.
Which is wild horta. It's these mountainous, high in antioxidants and stuff like that. And they cook everything, so and they literally, the way they soak them and everything, it's a laborious thing. My father still does that. He grows his own horta.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, he still grows his own horta, and occasionally, even though I'm a carnivore, 95% carnivore, I do consume some of it. I do enjoy it, especially with lemon juice, and it's really nice.
I love it. And I love how it changes too, because it'll be, whatever they pick or whatever is out. So like the sea glass season, which is at the end of summer, is my favorite. It tastes like Singapore street noodles. It's really quite good. And I think that's something quite unique to the Greeks. Having traveled around, they cook everything. So the meat is very thoroughly cooked. Kind of everything is thoroughly cooked, which is very different. And perhaps due to the climate, honestly, because I think in past times, things probably would have rotted pretty quickly.
Precisely. Yeah. And I mean, it's also, a lot of it's salted as well. We very much a population that use a lot of salt, which is a good thing. I think that's part of the robustness. When I look at other populations around the world, even tribal populations that do not consume a lot of salt tend to not have centenarians amongst them.
That's a really good point. And salt is so important. It's really prized here. It's probably my favorite food. If we were going to put it down to it, I really love salt. And here, the island of Limnos, it's a Greek island up in the north, has this wonderful salt flat that you can go each year and wild harvest your own salt and keep it for the year. And that's what we eat in the house. But yeah, the Greeks they eat a lot of salt, and the dairy is very salty as well, right? Dairy has a lot of minerals in it. And when you make the cheese, you use a lot of minerals as well.
That's right. Exactly. I've always said to people that the dairy products in Greece are very different. They're very mineral dense because it's the way they actually prepare them and stuff like that. So
The
the
cheese
nutrient density
here.
is just great.
Yeah, you know what surprised me the most? Well, there probably so many things surprised me about Greece, so I shouldn't say the most. But one thing that really surprised me about Greece was the complete array and wealth of types of cheese and the varieties and the things that you can do with that cheese. You know, the rest of the world, they know about feta, right? And that's kind of all you get exported to the rest of the world. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of cheese here. And so even at my local market, when I go, it's a full circle around maybe 10 women working and cutting up the cheese of hundreds of different kinds of Greek cheeses, all for different purposes, some for cooking, some for not cooking, very specific with each one, to the point where on my first trip to Greece many years ago, a friend made an 11-course meal for me entirely out of Greek cheeses.
Sounds fantastic to me.
It was one of the best nights I've ever had. It was incredible. Yeah. So the cheese here is really just it's a element of pride, I would say, because everywhere you go, that region has a cheese, and it could just be 10 minutes down the road, they'll have a different cheese. It may be called the same thing, but it's a very different cheese than 10 minutes before. And it's something, oh gosh, I mean, if anybody's in the business world, you could really take the cheese out into the world and do great with it, because it's a little hidden gem here.
It is. That's true. And there's a lot of regional varieties as well from different areas. There's not the standard, and I mean most people know about feta, but even feta, a lot of people get the standard, what I call the Athenian version, or the Yanina, Ioannina, which is up in the northwest, where Dodoni, which is the big company there in the northwest, and that's the two varieties that are sort of dominant outside Greece. But within Greece, you know, they are they're not as big. A lot of people don't realize these players that actually do a lot of exporting aren't that big in Greece, because Greeks are can be parochial about their regional foods as well. So they're not going to go to the supermarket and buy something from another region. They'll go to a smaller store that sells particular varieties that they've grown up with for all their lives. So it's very much a bit like Italy in that respect, very regional in terms of the cuisine, the types of cheeses, and the ways they prepare certain things. But in general, I mean, the tradition of cooking things thoroughly, and I think that's another thing with the plants, because they're soaked. A lot of the methods that are used to deactivate a lot of the anti-nutrients,
Yes.
which is a critical component. And even though I from my own perspective, in terms of N15 data, when we look at the archaeological evidence of isotope analysis, I don't see plants as being necessary, but I do see them as medicinal, and I do see them as, you know, adding them to a food for medicinal reasons. They can be health promoting. I don't have a problem with a number of these greens, especially if they're not the supermarket variety, but they're more of these traditional varieties. Much harder to find in places like Australia, unfortunately. But in Greece, they still exist, and they still are part of also the Greek Orthodox faith of fasting as well, which is, you've probably noticed.
Oh yeah, very well. Well, what's interesting to me about it is that it's often talked about as a vegetarian time of year when it's not. I found usually a whole fish soup is cooked every day, so you have a whole fish nose to tail in that soup. So there is still that kind of like protein fat, but it is a much lighter time of eating for sure. And you're not doing the dairy and you're not doing the meat during that time. No, I agree with you. I mean, part of why I'm doing the work that I'm doing is so that people can really see with their own eyes that not just scientifically, but that we really don't require plants for life at all. We know that scientifically, but to see it is another thing. And we've got all these carnivore tribes around the world who really thrive and do very well without plants. In fact, far better than we do. Plants can be used, and they can be tools that we use, or they can be things that we fall back on, but they're not a requirement or a necessity. And even antioxidants, although they've been touted as being, or heralded as being so wonderful, they actually have huge problems. For instance, they protect cancer cells from being seen by the immune system and all sorts of things. So yeah, but the Greeks, as you know, they use a lot of herbs. So whether they're drinking tea, like I have some of the mountain tea here that I'm drinking, or
Say the wono.
Yeah, I love it.
My dad still grows it.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, the herbs are really used quite wisely here. What I love, in a lot of cultures, you don't use mint in food too much. It's more of a tea. And here, I think it's what makes the beefsteak and some of the meat patties so delicious.
That's right.
It's the interweaving of the spearmint, and that can be helpful for people with hormonal issues and all sorts of things. So yeah, they definitely utilize those herbs. With the greens, those are very high oxalate, the horta, but they do eat it seasonally. Like there are certain seasons I just cannot get horta here at all. I tried very desperately during one year. I was leading a medical retreat, and I had told all these ladies about the wonderful horta for months, and then I couldn't find it anywhere. It just wasn't available.
Yeah, and that's true. That's true. It is a seasonal food, and at the same time, in many cases, they also, when it's not a fasting period, they do combine it with a lot of dairy, and dairy does bind the oxalates, which is one thing. Generally speaking, I mean, when you look at a peasant type plant, the plant components that are usually traditionally being used, from my own recollections, people didn't use a lot of phyllo pastry because it was expensive back, especially in the 70s. And you had my auntie used to, when we used to go to the village, she would make the traditional kolokithopita, which is basically zucchini pie. And it was just basically dairy and zucchini, the inside of the zucchini in sort of grated. And that was, and with a lot of dairy products in it, without any feta, just in the oven like that, in a sort of a thin type, well cooked, and you'd cut these pieces, and that would be like a side thing to your main meal, which was basically what they had. But I mean, as we've moved now forward in this era, people use far more phyllo than they used in the past because it's cheap. That's the reality.
They do. No, it's true. It's become cheap because you can manufacture it. It was really an art to create that. I've seen it handmade, and a lot of the old ladies will still hand make their own, but it's paper thin that they use. So the bulk of the food that you're getting when you get any of those pies is just a really thick amount of either like cheese or cheese and greens, depending on the kind of pie that you're ordering. And then this paper thin layer of phyllo, it's almost no carbohydrates at all, really.
That is true. That is true. I mean,
yes,
I'm probably
in the mountainous towns.
Exactly. I'm probably exaggerating a bit. It's probably more, I would say, the Greeks in Australia, probably the Greeks in America.
Oh yeah, the Greeks in America for sure. And
they
I would say
do indulge with a lot of phyllo.
Yeah, and the tourist regions here for sure. You get the thick layer.
That's what I mean. It's because that's what they sell here. I mean, a lot of the Greek outlets have, because people like, let's just be honest, in Australia, North America, those parts, they do like their bread. They do like more wheat based. Where in Greece, traditionally, I mean, you've been to villages and all that, people don't like that too wheaty. They want the cheesiness. That's what they want. They're after that. It's the dairy component which is the most important in the actual pie in itself. And I mean, a lot of pies are basically they're actually just dairy based, like teropitis and whatever. It's just dairy based and nothing else. It's just I mean, when I was back in 2006, I actually went to Agriño, which is on the west coast, where my parents come from the outskirts, from but Dad comes from a mountainous region, but that's where we sort of lived. That's where I did my high school. But they still had the old pies. And when I was there, and I'm going, oh God, and let alone some of these outlets that still, the Provia's Yogurtis, which is basically a yogurt, lamb's yogurt, the thick sort of stuff. You need a spoon. It just spoon it out. It's so thick. It's you can literally. Sometimes it gets so thick you use a knife to cut it and grab pieces. It's sort of. It's a yogurt without any moisture in it, basically. It's really thick, creamy, and the fat content, is phenomenal in terms of that. And that's what it makes it so nice, So where most of ours tend to be more protein-based in the West, in countries outside the Greek world, they tend to be more of that, which I don't really enjoy them as much, because I find myself sometimes I prefer having cream than basically a yogurt here, because it's just so unenjoyable in a sense.
It's true. I think, you know what it is? I think it's the sheep cream that they make the yogurt from here is so delectable. I think there's no better dairy than sheep dairy in terms of taste and quality and all of that. And that's really what's used here. And so when you get yogurt elsewhere, it's usually strained, it's low fat. And here they're using the cream to make it. It's this fatty, rich, tart, wonderful thing that can easily go with a savory dish, like you eat it with your beef teki, or you add some honey and have it that way as a dessert. But it's just a much more delectable food, I would say.
Exactly. Yeah. It's completely, if somebody hasn't tried it, if you ever get to Greece, any of my subs, go and try it. You'll be amazed how nice it is.
Yeah, on that subject, it's interesting because I grew up really eating foods from all around the world. My dad traveled the world for work, so we were always going to really neat restaurants and trying different things, and I loved that. And interestingly enough, the one cuisine I wasn't that crazy about was Greek, having it in America, because all I had were like the pitas and these kind of things, and especially. There just wasn't really anything that really struck my fancy. The tomato cucumber salad, that wasn't my thing. The second I got to Greece, I realized that's not the Greek diet at all. And now it's my favorite cuisine. The Greek food here is so impeccably made. Like the meat is really delectable. So for instance, the beef teki that I keep mentioning, it's because I have a love affair with them. They look like hamburgers. And in the States, I was never a hamburger person. I love meat, but hamburger wasn't one. And partly that's because in the States, they're kind of bland. Hamburger, really the flavor you get from the toppings and everything else. And since I wasn't eating those toppings, it wasn't very exciting. Well, here, they take such an art into everything they do, and especially in making the meat. And so the flavors that are in there are so wonderful, and it's so moist and lovely that that you could just live on that and yogurt alone. So the Greek food in Greece is so different than you get at Greek restaurants around the world.
Exactly. And the herbal element is something that you don't find in a lot of other, and it's subtle in some regards. In other regards, it's got a bit of bite to it. There are so many variations in the sort of flavors and the way they do things. I mean, I mentioned to some of my people about how to use rosemary and actually create literally liver like sticks, like overcook them with rosemary and all that, and the actual flavor of the rosemary gets and completely changes the flavor of the actual of the liver. And I've actually given it to other people, and they go, God, this is great, this is fantastic. What is it, Harry? Just keep on eating it, I'll tell you after.
It's so true.
Because the moment you tell them that it's liver, you know what happens with an Australian? Oh, they stop and they go, well, just a moment ago you really loved it. Then they sort of think about it and they go, it isn't too bad. Let me just try another one.
No, I can understand that, because having the liver here, it tastes better than any I had before. I always like to have liver with like onion or bacon or something else. And here it's often served by itself. So you just saute the liver up and it is delectable. It's so good. And it's mostly, I would say, maybe the most common appetizer I see on menus as well. It's pretty prolific food.
I think also there's another element to it. A lot of, because Greece is 80% mountainous, and a lot of these animals are coming from mountainous areas, and they're consuming these really hardy type plants. And those are they tend to actually change the fatty acid profile. That means in terms of more omega-3s, which is one element, but also some of the other sort of characteristics. So I think it's even the protein characteristics, also the mineral content. So the livers in Greece, I think it's the difference in mineral, because Greece, the soil, I mean, I usually say the thing that people ask me, what do they grow in Greece? Stones. I usually, as a joke.
That's true.
But it's so true. It's so rocky. You can't really have traditional agriculture like you get in other places in the world, grain agriculture and stuff like that. Most of that got imported anyway after the Second World War. But it's really so rocky that the mineral content of the land is what I think, because it's volcanic. The whole place is volcanic. It's, been molded by volcanic activity, the islands and everywhere else. And I think that volcanic soil and the mineral content goes into the animal, and it really changes the actual characteristics and flavors.
It really does. Yeah, especially with the sheep. The sheep are so wonderful in the lamb because they're very picky. They'll only eat the wild greens. You can't feed them corn or wheat. They just die if you try to. So their fat profile is always really good, but it does still vary based on where you are. And the nice thing about being here is that the soil is so rich in those minerals and those plants are so diverse that you get a much higher content of DHA and the fatty acids, even than a regular sheep or lamb would normally get. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And the milk, the dairy is much higher in potassium and some of those things as well. The thymic gland in sheep and lamb is one of the highest sources, natural sources of potassium in general across the board, but the Greek lamb is much higher than the average.
Yeah, that's true. For a lot of those, and that's probably the advantage. And it's something that I've actually tried to promote to my subs as well, that you need to get organ meats. You can't do a carnivore diet that is steak only. I don't really believe that. While you can get away with it, because the level, I mean, probably the only key vitamin that you need for fat and protein type of metabolism is primarily riboflavin. That goes up quite a bit, where thiamine and a number of the others come down. There are still issues that I find with pantothenic acid and stuff like that. I did something with Bar K a while ago, found a sort of an old study that actually showed the storage, that actually there is some storage where people don't believe there is.
That's right. Yeah, I've seen that too.
Yeah, you've seen, yeah. And the thing is, that's the only one that you don't want to really go crazy on as well. But usually in animal foods, it's more balanced, which is the nice thing about it. It's something where I usually say to people, if you've got sort of neurological, or you're not really doing so well, do a B complex, but it has to be all 50s, not above that, and do it for a couple of months. Rebuild your gut microbiome, because that's what the beneficial bacteria exchange the B vitamins, and you can rebuild that, and then once you've rebuilt that, then get off them, because they will do the job, and the food will supplement the remainder. So that's how you have to see it, and that's why ancestral diets are so important. And I'm glad that Greece hasn't really jettisoned too much, because that's probably what keeps them healthier than some of the other populations in Europe.
Definitely. And they are much healthier than the other populations. They've done better with coronavirus as well. So not just the longer term illnesses. But no, I've seen the same. So I didn't say in the beginning of this, but my specialty is in difficult to treat illnesses. So I usually get the people that doctors don't know what to do with, whether it's stage 4 cancer or dysautonomia, nervous system disorders, these kind of things. And a lot of nervous system disorders are B vitamin deficiencies, but some are from B excess. And I find that, especially with the influx of naturopaths practicing in the States, they're prescribing B vitamins and not telling people to ever stop. So they take them for like 10 years. And then I get them and they've got neuropathy from B toxicity rather than deficiency.
Precisely.
Luckily, that's still pretty rare. But yeah, you're so right to tell people 3 months, because they can be so important. Like I had, when I was ill back in the day, I had severe neuropathy from the neck down, and B6 reversed it along with a low carb diet and alpha lipoic acid. But it only took 6 weeks. It wasn't something I had to keep taking. And I had been vegetarian before that for many years. So no surprise, I had a B deficiency, right?
Well, exactly.
Yeah. And with the meats, you get it in the complete form. So that's really the ideal way. You shore up any deficiencies, and then you get it from your diet and from your microbiome, because there's, so many people come to me with MTHFR gene expression, which is, it's common. It's about 40% of the population. And for them, they're often really lacking Nissl 1917 bacteria, which makes the folate and makes the B12. And when you have enough of that bacteria, usually you see that gene stop expressing in the negative.
Exactly. I mean, I've done a video clip as well that actually looks at the importance of riboflavin in actually upregulating the actual enzyme, so it actually improves its expression and function. So even though you may have a suboptimal B9, B12, by adding more riboflavin, it's a bit of a hack, but it's not something. You will get it from animal foods, which is a good thing, but at the same time, if you want to permanently correct this problem, you've got to rebuild your gut microbiome. You've got to bring back the beneficial bacteria that produce it. A bit like the one that the 2 Reuteri type strains that I've sort of been promoting recently, from Sweden, which really actually promote production of B9 and B12, which is really important for people, because the problem is when it comes to the food supply, in particular the modern food supply, we can't guarantee the sort of quantities in a lot of foods, even in animal foods, especially in countries like Australia and other parts of the world where you could say the soil quality is lacking.
Yes. Yeah, and for a lot of people as well, because so many foods are fortified with, say, B12 or B6, these kind of things, they end up with a deficiency in B1, or just from eating too much processed food. And B1, like B2, really is almost more of an enzyme. It's needed for most of the other B vitamins to be processed. So, working with the individual B vitamins,
it does all those catalyzing effects. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, that's right. And so you can get yourself into trouble with some of that, but also it can be really necessary to fix that deficiency as well, to address that directly. And you see that most in a lot of rice eating cultures. You see a lot of the thiamine deficiencies, the white rice eating cultures, especially if they've taken some of the modern advice and stopped eating maybe the pork and things that are high thiamine and usually a staple in that diet.
Yeah, that's I've noticed that in Asia as well, because I've traveled a lot through Asia, and when a population consumes too much rice and they're not getting, especially meats like pork and stuff like that. And I've always said, because people usually in the carnivore community say, well, where do I get my thiamine? I said, pork's your best option.
Yes, you can definitely get it in pork, no problem. And then once you get rid of that deficiency, then you can maintain it. There are patients where I have like severe dysautonomias and things like that, where we absolutely use B1 therapeutically, but short period of time. It's never a long-term thing that you want to do, for sure.
And that's the key thing with B vitamins. You really should be getting it from the food, 2 from a healthy gut microbiome, and supplementation should be, to fix a deficiency and correct, certain past lifestyle things like we've both done and we both did. But I found that I've come across a number of people that have sort of contacted me for the same reason, where they were taking a massive amount of, of B vitamins, and they couldn't get to sleep.
Yes.
They were struggling to get to sleep. Yeah. And I'm going, okay, you've overdone it. Who recommended this? Oh, my doctor. Oh, great.
Right. Yes.
And I remind my people, I said, like most of the naturopathic doctors are pushing vitamins and minerals, and most of the MDs are pushing pills. It's
so true. And it's still, it's still very much the same kind of model. It's like, okay, well, you go into a natural practitioner's office and they just prescribe supplements in the same way you would medication. And that's really the model we need to get away from, especially for the gut microbiome, because really the less you intake, the better. The more simple your diet, the less complicated, the less vitamins and all those kinds of things, the better. So especially in terms of multivitamins, I think multivitamins often are really just a waste of most, like, money, time, all those kinds of things, because the body doesn't have that many enzymes to break down that many things at once. But yeah, so one of the things I often do with my clients is just a complete supplement purge, and especially if they're needing real gut healing, like you do on the GAPS diet or on carnivore diet, these kind of really, I would almost call them PhD level diets for getting someone better. You've got to take all that out. All the supplements have to go, and even just a tiny bit of starch in someone's diet that could be coming in through the supplement can be feeding the bacterial overgrowth and keeping them alive.
That's exactly right. I mean, I've sort of been promoting on my channel to people that you need to, there's a nexus, which is basically your liver, your stomach, and really everything starts at the stomach. As it's coming through the mouth into the stomach, if there's not enough acidity there, you're going to have problems. You fix the stomach, most things settle themselves, unless you've got issues with gallstones, gall sludge, stuff like that. And then those require some other steps. I mean, usually you'll have backed up liver as a consequence, which you'll have some fatty droplets deposited in there, so you need choline to get it out, or taurine to break down the sludge and move the sludge out, which is the other thing. So I tend to put them on. I usually only consume about 2 to 3 grams of taurine, but when it comes to people that have got sludge in particular and stuff like that, I push them up to 6, because I really just want to clear that stuff out for a couple of months. And then it's just, how do you feel? Are you feeling better? Is it functioning better? You don't want people on doing high of anything for too long, even though the only people, I mean, I know that taurine synthesis collapses after 65. So the only time I would go up to 5, and that's, in about a decade's time, when I get to that sort of age bracket, that is when I will go up to 5 grams, just to mitigate that. But also, I'll actually focus on my niacin side as well, because that gets depleted. All healing depletes niacin. Just goes through niacin like there's no tomorrow. And so I usually, I sort of supplement a bit with niacin. I started because of my cardiovascular reasons, but I never went high, because I realized there were risks with going too high, with especially impeding glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, and a number of other pathways. And it can interfere even with the hormone acting, like your vitamin D, the way that actually can interact in an adverse way, like a lot of excessive B vitamins can as well. It's not only niacin, but I find that niacin, as long as you stay below 300 milligrams, you're in the safe zone. So I sort of get a 250, I'll snap it in half and have it once every couple of days, because I do get a lot of niacin in the foods that I consume. I consume most of the meats and seafood and all that are very high niacin. So it's
No,
basically
that's
just to give myself that extra, slightly above baseline for that additional healing and stuff like that. In particular in summer, when I'm out in the sun for quite some time, it heals and reduces the effects of UV radiation as well. So, you know.
no, it's nice and it's really amazing. I for many years, at the beginning of my career, for many years, I was the director of nutrition for a mental health clinic. And niacin is really incredible with a number of what we would call mental health conditions that are really quite physical, from addiction behaviors to schizophrenia. They're often very deep niacin deficiencies. So with schizophrenia, I've always used the carnivore diet, which we used to call the fiber-free diet back in the day before it became more popular. And but it's an ancient diet that's been used in medical circles. In Russia, it's been used for centuries for schizophrenia, and it works wonderfully for it. But people who didn't know about that would often in the nutritional world use niacin for reversal of schizophrenia. Very high levels are required, but there's a cost for that, like you're speaking about. So sometimes the cost is worth it when you're dealing with a really major disease or with an addiction. For instance, you probably know this, but maybe your audience doesn't. The man, Bill, who opened Alcoholics Anonymous and started it, niacin was a core part of his protocol. You were supposed to take 3,000 milligrams of niacin a day, along with the 12 steps. When he passed away, that part just kind of fell off. I imagine it wasn't a conspiracy. I think people just didn't realize how important it was.
That's right. That's all it was.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And when that happened, unfortunately, the success rates just plummeted down to 3%, whereas where they are now. So it still works for people, but not a large percentage.
Yeah. Oh,
And that's
look,
partly because,
precisely.
some of the physical aspects of addiction aren't being dealt with. And I think the more we learn about the microbiome and the neurons and the feel-good chemicals, I think people are going to start focusing on that much more with mental health.
Well, a lot of people, even point to me, because I actually did suffer for, a number of years before I had my cardiovascular issues. I was probably heavily deficient in niacin as well. And I did suffer for about a couple of years, depression and anxiety. I really didn't feel comfortable and all that. And it was after my cardiovascular episode, I sort of had changed a bit, a few things at that later stage. And I think I cut back on my drinking and a number of things that tax niacin as well. And it seemed to basically resolve and make me feel happier and better. But then eventually when I made those radical changes a decade ago, and when I, for the first time, started using niacin, it was a bit annoying with the flushes and stuff like that.
Oh,
but,
yes, not comfortable.
I got used to it. But the thing is that I noticed was I wasn't depressed anymore. Yeah. I wasn't anxious anymore.
Yeah.
I was happier.
Yes.
And I had a more youthful predisposition.
Yes. Yeah, I can't tell you how common that is. It was so rewarding to work in that mental health clinic because people would come in with anxiety who really didn't have anxiety at all. They had histamine intolerance, but they didn't know, and it was presenting as anxiety, or they would have a niacin deficiency like you dealt with, or a dopamine deficiency, or a serotonin deficiency. All of these things can be addressed through diet, and you see a radical difference in 6 weeks. I actually built together a little boot camp that people can go through for this very purpose, because when you get your blood sugar balanced and your nutrition up, most of those things go away. And luckily I got to see this. So I was telling you earlier, I spent about 6 months in Africa earlier this year. I was down in Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is a really interesting place because they've had a radical history, right? Like upheavals, Rhodesia was upended, but it wasn't a very violent overthrow and these kind of things. But that being said, they have been in turmoil really ever since. Financially, the financial system has just gone to pot. People are hiding money under the mattress. It's worth nothing anymore, these kinds of things. And so the people have been through really extensive stress, losing their homes, losing their properties that have been in the family for 300 years, all sorts of things, like really big stressors. And yet in the midst of this, I'm working with a health insurance company there And I was asking him, the owner, I was asking him, what kind of health issues do you all deal with the most? Because we're collaborating and putting together protocols for them. And I thought depression would be one, because in the States, depression and anxiety is something like 1 out of 2 people at least.
That's right.
I'd
Yes.
have to look at the stats. It's very
It's
high.
pretty bad in Australia as well.
Yeah, so I just assumed it would be one of their top issues and top financial payouts. They don't deal with it at all. The people are not anxious and depressed there. And what's interesting about that is that they are a steak and beef culture. There was not a single day that I had in Zimbabwe without a huge steak on my plate. I was almost meated out by the end, which is saying a lot. And they really, they have a lot of the old world culture still in there. So you sit down for proper meals at proper times. There's a lot of the community aspect that you see in some of these blue zones and other places where people are, like, honestly, all of Greece outside of the cities is also very long living. But they have this tight community a lot because they've all been through so much, along with tons of meat. And the meat aspect, I'll tell you why it's important for your listeners. The amino acids that are found within meat, the different kinds of proteins, are essential for making your feel-good chemicals. So you need the amino acids in a set number of them, plus the good bacteria, plus plenty of cholesterol in your diet to make the feel-good chemicals in your gut. And then those go up to the brain, with the exception of dopamine. And so they're eating all the right foods for that. Plus they're getting tons of sun. It's very warm and sunny. They're all out in the sun in the morning. So yeah, it's interesting to see in different parts of the world where you see that anxiety and depression, and it typically has less to do with what the people have been through and more to do with the nutrition and the lifestyle, for sure. Just like in your case, dealing with that niacin. Yeah. And it's so nice because often, people with anxiety and depression, they go through years of therapy and all these kinds of things. And when you find the right thing, it can be fixed in, a matter of weeks.
Yeah, and it's a loss of time that could be used more productively. And also the ramifications it has for family life and other members. It's not only the person that's going through that, but other members of the family are suffering with that person.
With them.
So
and I would say it's a community as well, because when we're depressed, we're not creative. We're not creating things. We're not doing things for the better good or inspiring or any of those kinds of things. We're kind of on this low level, zero energy zone. And so, yeah, I would say the whole community suffers when someone is depressed.
That's true. Exactly. Let's sort of venture outside Athens.
Mm-hmm.
And let's venture to our favorite blue zone island, Ikaria.
Yes.
And give you a bit of a background of, when you went there, what you've seen, which parts, and the variations between the sort of the areas, the real blue zone part, which is in the sort of rural, more less urban type areas, and what you saw and what you experienced.
Sure. So Ikaria is a really interesting island, and I've been jonesing to go because having been living in Greece, I see that the Mediterranean diet that we're taught in the States, at least, is nothing like what the Greeks eat at all. It's really quite opposite. And so when I was hearing about Ikaria being touted as a blue zone, and what they were saying that they ate, that it was all these beans and vegetables, I was thinking, that doesn't make sense. That really doesn't make sense. So I wanted to go, and I brought my camera, and I spent several weeks there this summer and went all over the island. I actually took the time off client work, which is not something I ever do with travel. I'm usually going to do the research on the weekends or in the mornings, but I wanted to get a full spectrum immersion of this island in lots of different regions, having known what we talked about earlier, how different it can be one village to the next. So I really wanted to cover the whole sphere. Now, Ikaria is different in a number of ways. It's right next to Turkey. There's just 2 little small islands, well, one kind of big island before you get to Turkey, but it's on the more eastern spectrum of Greece. And it has an interesting political history. When the communist situation kind of fell apart in Greece. And I don't know how much people know about Greece's history, but they had a big civil war in addition to World War II and these kind of things. And many people, like my partner's family, were refugees from that war. So they fled to New Zealand. I don't know if that's how your family left or not.
There's a few. I mean, on my mother's side, they were with the more conservative side of politics. On my father's side, they were more with the sort of the ethnikiadistasi, as it's called, the national with the rebels, sort of on dad's side. I mean, a number of them were actually ex-military people. When the Germans invaded the country, I mean, my grandfather's brother, Alekos, he's passed away. And he was an officer in the Greek military, and he wasn't able to escape Greece and end up in Egypt like a lot of them did. And the officer corps that remained in Greece joined the resistance, you know, as a consequence. So politically they changed, you know, when you join something and all that. But Greece has got a different sort of, even when they've had political strife, as you've probably known from history, they don't, you kill people in sort of armed conflict, but you send people into exile. You know, normally you don't knock them off like happens in other sort of parts of the world. It's part of the Greek Orthodox tradition, but also goes back to antiquity, where people were sent into exile if they were basically opponents of that society. And the same thing happened in the Byzantium era. It was you could only kill, so to speak, in battle, or somebody threatened your life, or that sort of stuff, or harmed you in some way, so you were taking revenge. But in any other way, it's sort of frowned on in the culture, so to speak. You understand the culture, what I'm talking about. But the Civil War was really brutal. It was very brutal. Whole villages were literally split in half and at each other's throats, and brother against brother. It was a difficult time that most Greeks don't like to chat about or talk about. I mean, my father's a bit like that. He's sort of really tries to ignore the whole, you know. I'll let you sort of continue with your...
I think it was such a difficult time because you had the Russian invasion. So I know his family were taken into gulags during that time, and then they were gone for 10 years in the gulags. And when they came back, then there was the Civil War. So a lot of times too, people left just because they didn't want to deal with any more war, you know, nothing to do with parties at all. They were just like, nope, had basically enough, I'm out. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, most people were on different sides. If you really speak to the people, they really didn't understand the politics. They were just basically, certain parts of their family were with one side, certain parts of the family were with the other, and so you just went with that group. It wasn't so that these people were, you know, people of the land. You know, they weren't highly educated. You know, they were just more traditional peasants and stuff like that. That just got caught up in this whirlwind of the post-Second World War, unfortunately, and it didn't really help the society, because I think to some extent it sort of ushered in certain types of foods, which I've talked about in the past, grains and oils and stuff like that weren't there before. But the devastation, you know, with the Marshall Plan, sort of they put money behind these things because they were easy to produce, basically, you know, to sort of feed a population, so they wouldn't succumb politically to the left, so to speak.
Yes. 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 No, it's so true. Even with coronavirus, you see the way the Greeks are, what I've found communally is that they're so tight. So if one person goes one way, they all do. They go together as a community. It's really actually a lovely thing, I've got to say. Like they're very compliant, I would say, with the situation, even though they're known as rebellions in many ways, you know, the riots and everything.
Oh, exactly. I mean, Greeks are very rebellious, but they are, they've got that strong sort of patriotism, or that sort of, that if something's important for the community, they rally. It's very easy to get them to rally. But at the same time, if they think that they're being conned, or something's wrong politically or whatever, they become very rebellious.
Yes.
So it's
Yeah, I think it's quite healthy, really. I kind of love to see it, and they take care of their families in the same way. It's wonderful. But yeah, so Ikaria. So Ikaria was when the Communist War fell apart. A lot of the heads of the Communist Party went to Ikaria, and you can see that in the lack of tourism. As still to this day, there's not a big commercial industry on Ikaria, and I think, and this is my theory, I think a lot of it is because the Communist Party is still very active, so there's not the desire for sales and shops and these kind of things, right? It's more self-responsibility, have your own little farm, and these kind of things, and have their own tight community. So it's a different feel than the rest of Greece, where you have lots of these shops and these little like towns with lots of things for the tourists. This is really for the Greeks, this island, and their family that comes to visit in the summer, which is something that is just done throughout Greece. By the way, I know this isn't done in the rest of the world, but most Greeks go to their home village in the month of August. So that's where their parents are from, their grandparents, all that kind of thing. Maybe they were raised there as well. And so in Ikaria, you get that. And it's an interesting island because they have different topography than a lot of Greece. Like, for instance, most of Greece doesn't have...
I'll just interrupt you a bit. That's a really important point you made. The tradition of Greeks going back to their villages, going back to their the communities they come from, what they do is they reinforce those traditions.
Yes.
It's the reason why, even though new things have come into Greece, they haven't eroded completely the past, like it has happened to other parts of the world, where people have moved from rural areas to city areas, to urban areas, and have radically changed their lifestyle and diet and everything else. Where in Greece, because of that tradition of going back, even when they vote, they go back and vote in their own. They don't move their voting rights away from the area they come from. They're still tied to the land of that area very much. Sorry for interrupting you.
Oh, no, I'm so glad you did, because it is something that keeps the traditions alive. You're absolutely right. And so in Ikaria, the topography is very different. There's waves there. You can actually go surfing, which is rare in Greece. You don't really see that elsewhere. And because of that, they rely a bit more heavily on the meat than the fish. They definitely have fish, though. It's been downplayed how much fish they eat, I think. But they also, because it is so rocky, like you said earlier, Greece grows rocks. You don't see cattle. You don't see fields of grains. You don't see fields of rice or wheat or kamut or any of those kinds of things. Instead, what you see are a lot of sheep and wild pig and goats and chickens and these kind of things being raised. And they're really raised by each family. So each person usually has about 3 goats at least. And they have their little homestead, which this is just normal there, but so they wouldn't call it anything. They'd just be like, yeah, that's my home. But to us, on the outside, it would be called a homestead, because they've got their house, and then they have their animals for dairy, their animals for eggs, and their animals for meat. And then they'll have a patch for vegetables. And those are usually high yield vegetables. So not like the grains and those kind of things again. And then they produce everything themselves. They're very proud of their own cheeses. They really eat nose to tail an enormous amount of pork, I would say. I heard an interesting tale, and I have no idea if it's true or not, but I just love it. And it seems very Greek to me. So I think it might be true. But one of the ways, supposedly, that this island has held off the Turks for so long is by all the pork being eaten. So the pork is served everywhere you go. There are all these restaurants with sticks of pork that you can buy. And that was like their lack of cultural sensitivity towards the Turks.
I used to live off those pork sticks.
Yes, they're so good.
I know.
That's another food, that tastes totally different in Greece. And I think probably because the pigs are eating such a different food, and the wonderful cooking techniques, those slow roasting techniques that the Greeks use. Yeah. But
it makes a big difference the way you cook things. We cook things too quick. My father still cooks things over hours, slow cooking at a lower temperature, and really it just and also he has from a sort of a tradition where he'll boil the meat, and basically until you most of the actual water sort of being lost, so to speak. You know what I mean? And then he'll basically roast that.
Yes.
And so when it comes out, it's so tender and so soft. It just melts in your mouth. The meat is completely and utterly different, where most other people's roasts are basically quite tough.
Yes.
So
Yeah, it's really true. A roast is something you don't get excited about elsewhere. And here it's delectable.
I know.
Yeah. It's true. And the pork doesn't even taste like pork. I had it at a festival my first time, and I thought it was like really good chicken thigh, is what I thought it was. So yeah, it tastes totally different.
Yeah, I know. That's the thing that a lot of people don't realize. It's not only the food, it's not only the environment, the way, but it also the techniques that are employed. And I show people, like I've shown them a bit of videos, like with the kukuretsi, the way organ meats and all that. And I said, if you eat organ meats like this, you can very easily become addicted to organ meats.
Yes.
You know, where if you eat organ meats the way most people cook them, in a very bland way, it's no wonder a lot of people in the carnivore community sort of default back to a steak.
The ribeye.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
No, it's really true. And it's so easy to get here as well, because the butchers, whether you're in Ikaria or in Athens, they carry everything. So they have the whole animal, and you'll see lots of lambs and goats being strung up whole animal, and you can get any part you want. So like we have standing orders for marrow bones that I make once a week. It's one of my favorite things to eat. And then I always get a pig trotter for making broth that I just have on the stove at all times. I've got some cooking now, and then they have beautiful liver and spleen and kidney and all sorts of stuff. So it's just really easy to get, and they know what makes it taste good, and it's very fresh. So the butchers here are incredible, and the organ meat is much more tasty, I would say.
Yeah, that's true. I agree. I wouldn't. I sort of envy you in a sense, being so far away from that sort of.
It's so nice because so my residency is in Greece, but like I was saying before, I would pop in and out constantly. And so I didn't have the time to do these kind of slow cooks and get to know like the best spots to get these kinds of things. And ironically, they're all right in your face, because the grandmas are all buying this every week too. But I had missed a lot of my local ones. So I was going farther to get them and not eating them as often. And it's nice how easy it is to eat very healthfully here. It's effortless, which is lovely. And then of course, being able to stay here longer, there's time to do more fun things. Like last week, I salt cured egg yolks, which I just love. And I've got these soups constantly going, which is nice. When I was traveling constantly, I didn't do as many soups, and those are so good for your microbiome.
Exactly. Sounds really great. I mean, I still, occasionally, I do some like fish soups and all sorts of different soups and stuff like that.
I love the Greek fish soup. Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. Yeah, because a lot of it, I've tried other people's fish soups and I go, I don't like this. It's so bland. I mean, it's got no taste. You go, oh God, can you put some herbs in this?
And it can be the most delicious soup too. But yeah, you've got to know how to make that one for sure.
That's exactly right. I mean, I'm sort of lucky in Tasmania where I can still get access to things like calamari, squid, and octopus and things like that, which is great because I mean, you can tell us a bit about. I'll let you just tell us a bit about the sort of delicacies of that sort.
Yes, octopus is definitely high up on my list. The Greeks make octopus better than anywhere else I've had. I think because of all the preparation. You have to really do a lot of preparation to get octopus done right. And they do it right here. And it's lovely because the street food here and in Sicily as well, I found, is typically like octopus, spleen, and then meat on a stick. That's like what you would eat while you're walking down a street, which is so different than the kind of fun fare we have in many countries of the junk food and that kind of thing, the chips, the popcorn, the funnel cake, it's so different. But the octopus here is not chewy, it's not tough, it's just delectable and delicious with a little lemon and some herb. Just perfect.
It's basically, it's beaten against rocks.
Yes.
And it's tenderized in a
Genuinely
certain way. It is heavily tenderized. And I used to get
Yeah.
my father, well, he used to get me to do all that.
No, I'm sure. It's hard work.
Exactly.
Yeah,
It is hard work. Exactly. That's why I was allocated those duties as a son. You're allocated all the slave duties in a Greek family. So I pretty much did all those. But the end result was really tender octopus or calamari or whatever. And it's well worth the actual effort. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. And I think that's why the Greek food is so good. The Greek diet, in comparison to other diets, I would call pretty simple, meaning that there's usually just a few items in each dish. It's not a whole confabulation of lots of different things. There are exceptions, of course, but in general, you have like your meat, your yogurt, your side dish, your appetizer, your cheese, these kind of things, your wine. But the extent at which they do the preparation for the food makes it taste better than any cuisine. So even though it doesn't have a million different flavors in it, like a curry or something like that, it's far more tasty in its simplicity. So yeah, I think they've really mastered that far better than other cultures for sure. But the food is labor intensive. I mean, to make the octopus, you've got to beat it for, I think, hours or something ridiculous. It's a lot of work. Yes.
It's exhausting.
And that, what's interesting, that's something I didn't see on Ikaria. Usually on the islands, you get a lot of octopus, and you definitely get a lot in the mainland around the coast, not in the mountains, but on the coast. But that wasn't in Ikaria so much. So I'll tell you what I saw, because I think it was really interesting and very different in mainland Greece. One thing is that they don't have many carbs at all. They're not carb heavy. You don't have much of a breakfast. It's usually a coffee. And then lunch will be your meal, and that's going to usually be made by a grandmother, and it's different each day. So most of the menus were oral, based on what had been made. Same with the dinner menus. There were exceptions, and I took photos of as many menus I could so I could show that it's like a lot of meat, primarily, I would say. But not a lot of the carbohydrates until the evening. In the evening, you see the bread on the table. But what I found interesting, and I don't think I talked about this in my video, was that when, I'm going to say old man because that's usually who is at the cafes. It's usually the old men at the cafes with their glass of wine and maybe some food, and they get served a big basket of bread. The bread is almost never touched by the locals. I have to say, it is served with dinner, but I did not see it getting eaten. The tourists would come in and eat a ton of the bread, but I actually didn't see the locals eating it as much. So I don't know if it was those individual people that I saw or if that's a trend, but it seemed like the bread was there more for a soaking item. So like soak up the end of the sauce. And a lot of times
that's exactly what it is. That's all it is.
Yeah. So
we have a saying, bread is for pigs. It's not for humans, but we do like it to have. So we use bread as a thing to soak things up.
Yeah,
that's true.
I was surprised at how little of the bakery items were in Ikaria, because one of the things that when you watch Ikaria videos or you read the Blue Zone book, they really highlight that 3-day fermented bread that they have, and it's there, but it's I don't even know where they bought it, to be honest, because I saw 2 bakeries on the entire island, and I'm sure there's more, but that's what I saw. As opposed to on mainland Greece, there's a bakery on every single corner, and so it didn't seem to be much of a staple of their diet at all. And when I talked to the locals, I talked to a lot of. I actually have a ton of interviews, but when I cut this into a video, I didn't want to make it too long, so I just highlighted the one because I liked it the most.
Yes.
But when I talked to the locals, most of them would immediately say, yeah, I mostly eat goats. I don't eat a lot of carbohydrates. This isn't a carbohydrate kind of place, kind of thing. I think it's become more so since the influx of the potato, and we definitely see that now, but that's as of the last 50 years in Ikaria. And that too was different with the locals than the tourists. So the tourists, again, are Greek tourists primarily coming from the mainland. So these are like kids that left for college and they're coming back to stay with their family, these kind of things. And they've developed a lot of the same habits as mainland Greeks, especially city dwelling, and also just the rest of us. And that is that they eat a lot of French fries. So they come back and they eat a lot of French fries. But the people that lived on the island year round.
I was shocked in 2006. I was shocked at the amount. I'm going, God almighty.
Yeah, truly has taken over Greece, the potato. And the potato, as I know your audience knows, is not a Greek food traditionally. So same with tomato, same with zucchini, all these kinds of things are not native to Greece. So they're all very recent foods, and they have a lot of problems with them. They have a lot of solanine, they have a lot of lectins, all sorts of things that build up in the body and create issues. So anyway, so I saw it mostly with the younger crowd, not all of them though. Like the man I interviewed for the video, who's obviously young, I think he's maybe late 20s, early 30s. He lives there year round and he doesn't eat much carbs at all. He said almost never. But the ones that go to college in Athens and that kind of thing really eat a lot of French fries. And you could see the difference. Like Nikos, the man I interviewed, he was very fit, right? He looked very healthy.
Yeah.
They were great, yeah. Whereas a lot of the youth that I saw in their 20s and 30s did not look healthy, and they were the ones coming back from Athens. So they had tubby bellies, and they were balding, and they had health issues that they talked to me about, from eczema, psoriasis, dyslexia, these kind of things that we see elsewhere. Whereas with the ones who were still living on the island, I didn't see that so much. So as I mentioned in my video, I don't think it's going to be considered a blue zone much longer because of the influx of the new foods, but it has a potential to. That said, it's not a blue zone for the reasons that they said in the book. I mean, at all. They really missed the mark on those studies of the blue zone, how they conducted them, how they asked questions, and when they did it. With Greece, in any, I think, traditional culture, you have to do a year-round study because they eat so differently season to season.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, Ansel Keys, there was actually, he actually did a study in Crete at time of Lent. I mean, yes. People are basically fasting and eating very little. I mean, if you base your diet on that, you all year round, you'll waste away. It's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's not typical of their normal diet.
But it's,
so you have
it's the lack of not. This is what and I agree with you completely. You've got to, if you're going to study a people, you've got to understand their culture. You've got to understand their traditions. You've got to understand part of their lifestyle, because it is a key driver in the way they live, the way they eat and stuff like that. And I mean, nowadays we have what is called a globalized food culture, which is just junk food. But when we look at other populations around the world, there is a reason why they will eat seasonally certain things and not in other seasons. There's a lot of different elements. I mean, I know there was a South African population, which I can't remember now, but they are lactose intolerant, but they actually ferment. They're a herding, a pastoral population, but without lactose persistent genes. And they basically ferment all their dairy, all the lactose out, and they consume it in this sort of sour form. And it's a large part of their diet. So if somebody was to look at that, they would, could presume, their diet is this sort of whatever, and it's it's got a certain type, a certain combination of carbohydrates or whatever. But without actually looking at that tradition, they would miss completely that component that they've actually got rid of. Even though they consume massive amounts of milk, the amount of sugar in that milk is very low, or next to nothing. So totally that gets missed. So that's the problem when you do epidemiological research, observational research, and you ask the wrong questions.
You ask the wrong questions, and it happens all the time. And then also what I also see, and what I'm hoping to dispel with my upcoming trip, is that people will go to a region for a day or two. Literally, they'll go visit a tribe for one day and base their dietary recommendations on that one day, which is actually insane, unless they're like a carnivore tribe, because carnivore tribes are going to eat pretty much the same thing every day, but still variants within that, like with the dairy and these kind of things. But I think that's what's happened with the Hadza. People have gone for these 1 and 2 day tours and come back and been like, this is what they eat. And they eat completely differently year round and also day to day, because they're a hunter gatherer. So depending on what they hunt and what they gather that day is going to be a very different profile day to day. But if you go over the whole year, you can see a real thread there. Yeah.
And that's what does get missed. I always remind, because people will talk about the Hadza or this population or certain Papua New Guinean populations that consume a lot of carbohydrates in the Pacific. At the same time, they do consume a lot of coconut fat. Now, coconut fat, it is a medium chain triglyceride, and as a consequence, it does get converted very quickly to ketones, and so you don't have this sort of Randall cycle activation sort of effect. So that sort of gets mitigated because ketones get first preference, and usually they get preferential preference in the brain and in certain other tissue, especially the heart. And once that actually goes, most of the others are not going to be impeded. Most of the other nutrients coming from the carbohydrates are not going to be impeded. But if you combine carbs with long chain fats, you get a completely different effect. It's what the standard junk diet is. It's basically very high in long chain fats and very high in refined carbohydrates, and it's what basically just the system gets overloaded, and pretty much the cell goes, too much, we're stopping, we're down regulating these receptors, we're not taking any more in. As a consequence, you've got a lot of circulating sugar and carbohydrate and fats in terms of triglycerides, and that is basically insulin resistance. That is the standard SAD diet, really, in that regard, where these populations are completely different because of the seasonality. And that's really important. Even when they are consuming a lot of carbohydrates, they are usually a seasonal thing that they do, and they do it and they limit their hunting as well. So they're not getting as many long chain fats in that period. This is why you get this skewing of the data, where you come across Hunza, they're consuming more carbohydrates because they're going around. Why go? Because hunting is an inaccurate activity. This is the reason why we got into the domestication of animals, because it was much easier to basically have fatty animals around that we could actually utilize, rather than the hit and miss of the hunt and ending up 3 days without any food until you come across another animal that you could hunt. So these populations, when they've got something, a sure thing, so to speak, they will focus on that for a period of time. But if you come in as a researcher, as you said, and you notice that, and you ignore the remainder of the year and the sort of the seasonality and stuff like that, you could, and the reason why they're going to prioritize something, and then a lot of these researchers who are observation epidemiologists don't even understand the Randall cycle. Sometimes I listen to them and I go, that guy has no idea of some of these these physiological responses to this combination of energy. And I go, oh, okay, so we're not going to get much out of this person. But that's the unfortunate reality of nutritional science. It's very much built on the tradition of calories when it comes to
calories, macros.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Also, most of the people conducting these studies have never studied nutrition formally, ever.
That's
so
true
these
as
are
well.
People who don't have an eye for the field, and also don't work with patients and see what works and what doesn't and all of that. And they go into a region and they're like, this is great. So like with the blue zones, Dan went in no nutritional background. Now he studied the world, and that's not to say you have to have a degree or you don't have to study something formally to look into something, of course. But a lot of our nutritional studies that are done by scientists, by MDs, these are not people with a nutritional background in any way, shape, or form. So they miss the mark in many ways, like you're discussing. They just pure miss things that they need to be looking at quite innocently, I would say. It's usually not on purpose, of course. And with the Hadza, I mean, if you're going to call them one thing, I would actually call them meat-based. Are they hunter-gatherers? Yes, but their whole life is involved around getting meat. And most of the time in Africa, getting meat is not difficult. It can be, though. So if someone goes and they don't get much food for 3 days, but you have to remember during those 3 days, they're eating a lot of insects. They can get birds quite easily. There's a bird that is very obvious in the baobab trees. That makes its home. The male protects it, and the female is in there kind of nesting. And you can see those very obviously. So they'll go in and grab the bird and eat it. And then the monkeys are everywhere, and they do eat the monkeys and these
That's
kind of
true.
things. So yeah, so I think it's really, if you're
So
going to say
they do
one thing about
consume
them,
insects. I wasn't aware of that.
oh yeah, yeah,
I
absolutely.
know
Yeah.
I know large parts of West Africa, there's
Mhm.
massive consumption of insects, and parts of Southern Africa, but I didn't
Yeah.
realize that the Huns are, yeah, okay, there you go. I've just learned
Yeah,
something. Thank you.
especially the ants. The ants are a treat, really, in all cultures that I've seen throughout Africa. Everybody eats them. They're seasonal too, though. Animals are seasonal, like all of it's seasonal. So again, it does depend when you go, of course.
Mm.
And the Hadza are so different than the carnivore tribes next to them because they eat the tubers, they have the honey. But again, all of that's seasonal. So it depends when you go, and if you go for 2 days, you end up with a skewed view.
That